Hello everyone and welcome back to me, Shiva Wilson, and my channel, which is about whatever. Now today I have part 3 of the short story of Crystal Iron Man. So to catch up, Fieros the Crystal Iron Man has been made homeless, become psychotic, and believes himself to be a spiritual magician superhero, and ends up in jail after one of his delusions goes awry. Now, Crystal Iron Man Part 3. So, Krishna had been right. Prison had been inevitable after all. Futkim blamed the alcohol. It was always the alcohol that got him in trouble, never the weed. It was always the influence of alcohol that found him getting arrested, like the time in the graveyard where he'd gone and bought a big bottle of cider. He had been given £10 on the beg and had a little bit of found weed, so he did the usual thing and stared at the Queen and Jane Austen on the banknote and asked them what he should do with the money. The Queen had that knowing look in her eyes as usual, and after some deliberation, Futkim, Fieros the Crystal Iron Man, decided that the graveyard had great potential for magic, if only an orange guerbo could be created. A guerbo was a large globule of magical spiritual energy. Crystal Iron Man had come up with the idea of guerbo spontaneously when he noticed that when he was drunk and or stoned, a magical aura of fuzzy warm energy would follow him and pad him out, protect him and give him his powers. So the graveyard had great potential for magic. What with all the dead spirits and angels and tree-shaded areas among the graves, all it would need was an orange guerbo hanging in the air. So Fieros went to the nearby shop and bought a big bottle of cider and took it to the graveyard. He sat under a particularly magic-feeling tree and smoked the nubbins of weed he had, to get the guerbo going, then poured a line of cider in a circle around him, giving an offering to the pixies of the earth. Then he began drinking the cider, and soon he was steaming drunk and shouting at the deities from beneath the tree. He also found that one of the dates on a grave marker seemed to be in the wrong date order compared to those next to it, so he pulled up the small wooden cross and switched it around with the other one so as to be correct in his mind. There must have been some neighbours watching or listening. He was shouting Vishnu very loudly because after a while of creating the guerbo, the police showed up and arrested him for being drunk and disorderly, and for criminal damage done to gravestones. Luckily, no one had been around on the days where he'd set some of the angels free from their statues by breaking their wings. It was always the alcohol that got him in trouble. Like the time where he'd found half a pint of cider in a bottle outside one of his many temporary accommodations, drank it, and went happily walking off to Windsor through Eton. He remembered a time when he'd been lost in London at 2 a.m. and had clambered onto and over a parked car just because he could and no one was looking. When Futkim got to Eton, a car was parked right in the way of his walk, so he just got up and walked over the top of it, flexing his powers. Soon after this, a couple of security cars started following him at a distance, keeping an eye on him until, not long after, the police showed up and arrested him. Luckily, no damage was done to the car, so he was let off with no charges on that one. Futkim couldn't believe that just a tiny amount of alcohol had infused him with such fearlessness and power. He also blamed the deities, the Hindu deities, for getting him in trouble with the law so much. Fieros believed that the Hindu deities didn't like the police force and were trying to get him to take them down in some kind of global dissolution. Police dissolved, he called it, and it seemed that the deities wanted the forces of oppression to be disbanded across the world. There was, of course, the time where Futkim had been convinced that in order to save the world from COVID-19, the Hindu deities needed to be freed from the temple to touch the open air. Crystal Iron Man needed to get the deities out of the temple and into the street so they could work their miracles after being ionized by the outside world energies. In line with this need to save the world, Crystal Iron Man went to the Hindu temple in Slough in the middle of the night and found a double door at the side of the building. It was locked, but Futkim tried his best to open it anyway. He grabbed the handles with both hands and yanked the doors towards him with all his might. The deities needed to be free in the open air to help the world. He yanked and yanked, and the doors came open a little way each time before pulling themselves shut, and Fieros with them. After a few times of trying this, Futkim gave up and slipped off into the night. The next day or so, Fieros showed up at the Hindu temple of Slough in the daylight, and he casually went inside and started reading the spiritual books they had on a bookshelf at the back of the main temple hall. The temple leader didn't seem happy and got on the phone. Soon enough, the police arrived and arrested Crystal Iron Man. As the officer told Futkim his rights, Fieros looked into the eyes of Vishnu in a painting. Vishnu had bangles on, a bit like how the handcuffs were being put on Fieros. Vishnu seemed to raise his eyebrows and confer admiration upon Futkim. Vishnu seemed to be saying that it was a spiritual honour to be arrested in the temple in front of the deities. It seemed to be that some kind of sacred rite was occurring. Fieros was being initiated into a sacred pact with the deities. He was being arrested into a spiritual role and being given the jewellery that bound him like the deities had. After spending a night in the jail cell again, he was ordered not to go near the Hindu temple again. Oh well, he thought, at least I tried to set the deities free, and at least I got initiated into a secret sacred role. He didn't let it bother him any further. In fact, Crystal Iron Man saw his attempt to set the deities free as a success because the doors had opened somewhat and some of the heavenly light inside had spilled out. The CCTV camera had captured that much. The police showed him the footage and he said, "No comment," as instructed by his lawyer. Crystal Iron Man rolled up a fat joint and sat on the curb opposite A to B taxis in Hounslow. He looked down at the joint and it was so big and fat and white that it seemed to glow with radiance and magic. He went over to the taxi company window and greeted the worker inside. "Do you want to try some of this?" said Crystal Iron Man to the taxi call handler. "Oh no, I can't touch that," said the man in the window, wide-eyed with the shock at the size of it. "Fair enough," said Crystal Iron Man, and he took the spliff away and lit it for himself. It was dark and late, but the main road to the left was still fairly busy. Cars drove steadily left and right. Fieros sat there and smoked his spliff and began to enter a magical state of consciousness. He only cared about the taxi company because they had a calendar with a large picture of the goddess Sarasvati on the wall. He would come along to the taxi company window just to have a brief moment with the picture of Sarasvati. One night he had been going nuts and gave the guy in the window 30 quid that was supposed to be for Sarasvati to look after. When he came back a day or so later, now that he'd regained his senses, he asked the guy at the window for his money back. The guy said sorry, but that was not possible for some naff reason. Crystal Iron Man was dismayed. The other reason Futkim visited the A to B taxi company often was that one of the workers did smoke weed and often left tasty weed butts round the back of the small building. Fieros went to check the chucking spot there at least twice a day usually. The other place he checked on a daily basis was the White Bear pub. People often smoked weed out the front at night, and Fieros often found weed butts on the floor, on ledges, and in the flower pots. However, going past the White Bear at night was a bad idea, as he had recently found out. One of the security guards on the door had taken a reverse shine to our Futkim and shooed him away with taunts every time he approached the pub at night. One time, Crystal Iron Man got into a Jedi tussle with the man, who was off duty at the time and ugly, decidedly ugly. The man flung Fieros around and sent him running off in fear, while the man and a small crowd stood and jeered at Futkim, saying, "Don't come back, neat!" Neat was an insult that Fieros had gotten used to while homeless. It didn't really hurt because he barely understood it. It was supposed to stand for not in education, employment or training, but Fieros thought it was an accurate description, and as such it didn't bother him. He seemed to bother other people with his neat status, but that was their problem, not his. One time, before the white bear had become hostile, a group of young guys had taken pity on Futkim and had blessed him with a new pair of trainers and a small bag of fresh weed. Fieros gave the guy who gave him the weed some encouragement to chase the ladies, and that seemed adequate payment enough. Fieros was still sat on the curb opposite the A to B taxi company. He decided to go and see the White Buddha for advice. Usually the little white Buddha was in charge of teaching him his siddhis, special spiritual powers which only an enlightened one could possess. Tonight the advice from the white Buddha was to go and find somewhere to sleep. The little white Buddha was in the window of an estate agent down the road from A to B taxis. Fieros had done what he always did. He crouched in front of the Buddha, which was in traditional seated pose with a bowl in his hands and a blessing necklace made of yellow paper flowers around his neck. Fieros always thought that the necklace was a burden for the Buddha, the flowers singeing the Buddha's neck and chest with their energies. He looked into the Buddha's porcelain eyes and said, "Hello, dear," and then mentally asked him for advice. Fieros kept looking into the Buddha's eyes until he felt like it was time to move on. Find somewhere to sleep seemed to be the advice. It was dark and late, the middle of the night. Fieros presumed it was around 2 to 3 a.m. by now. He went back up the road past the many convenience and takeaway stores and went round the corner to the little spot underneath the metal stairway that led up to some flats behind the shops. There was already some homeless bedding there, some flattened cardboard boxes and a pillow, some old blankets, so he settled in there under the metal stairs. After an hour or two, someone came out of a flat above and came down the stairs, shoes clanking on the metal. The sound woke Fieros, and then the man came to him and said, "You can't sleep there, please move." Reluctantly, Fieros woke himself up fully, got up and started walking around it again. Suffice it to say that Crystal Iron Man didn't get much sleep sometimes when he was homeless. Well, it was getting light now anyway, so it was probably time to start his wandering and looking for weed on the ground. Fieros started walking a long loop around Hounslow, his eyes peeled to the floor. In fact, it was safe to go visit the White Bear, now that all the late-night drinkers and the evil, ugly security guy had faded away into the night. Luckily, he found a few weed nubbins lying around which started the day nicely. Fieros kept going around his loop, looking out for the deities, weed, cigarettes, and leftover alcohol as he went. He visited the gated apartment block car park that usually has some nice butts and sat down on the curb in a secluded spot under the shade of some ivy-covered trees and smoked the little bits. Rarely did Fieros the Crystal Iron Man want for weed. He found enough usually to stay high all day, and his psychosis, unbeknownst to him, kept his weed guerbo going throughout the dry periods. Cigarette butts and alcohol also filled the gap between weed nerps, as he called them. A nerp was a small bit of weed in a butt. He relied on the outdoor weed smokers to leave a little bit at the end of a joint on the floor, and he felt like it was a small miracle of magic every time one emerged on the blank pavement in front of him. It would soon be time for the Lakshmi Narayan Hindu temple to open, and Futkim remembered the advice that one of his little Ganesh statues had told him. Get poped and talk to Lakshmi. Poped meant stoned. Futkim had coined the term poped one time whilst extremely stoned, such to the point that he felt like he had gained powers of the miraculous, similar to the Pope, he presumed. When one was extraordinarily stoned, Fieros sensed, things would pope out of him. Things, events, money, people, goodies, miracles would exude out of the heightened consciousness. So the phrase getting poped was born and continued for a long time in Fieros and Jane's day-to-day vernacular. Where was Jane anyway? He sensed she would be around at some point, so he didn't concern himself with her. Jane had an uncanny knack of finding him wherever he was and hassling him to eat food and get help for his housing and whatever. Fieros had the paranoid feeling that his once steadfast partner in popeage was in fact stalking him. He put her out of his mind and focused on his mission to commune with the deities. He had definitely got poped, and now that it was past 10 a.m, it was time to head into the temple and talk to Lakshmi. Fieros liked the Lakshmi Narayan Hindu temple because they often left little statues and pictures out, presumably for the taking, and he always took something if they had it on the windowsill as an offering. This time in the temple he went in, took off his shoes and walked into the main hall area with the deities all arranged in a line-up on the stage, sat down and just looked in awe. He wasn't allowed to stay there long. The temple leader came over to him shortly and ushered him to get up and leave. Futkim thought this was ridiculous. In his mind he should be allowed to sit and meditate in the presence of the deities for as long as he wanted or needed. This was never the case in practice. Always if he sat too long, one of the temple leaders would come over to usher him out. This was not fair, but he did as they said anyway. He was glad to get any time at all with the large, highly decorated enamel statues of Lakshmi, Vishnu, Durga, Krishna, Radha, Rama, Sita, Lakshman, Hanuman, Ganesha, Shiva and Parvati. The deities were glorious, all standing upright, decorated with flower necklaces, sparkly clothes, and above were twinkly fairy lights changing colour intermittently. So what was today's reading of the deities' expressions? Krishna said, "You have to shoot it along the line." Futkim didn't know what Krishna meant, but intuited that he was supposed to shoot his awareness down the line of the statues, looking at each one briefly. Get poped and talk to Lakshmi was the old advice, so he looked at Lakshmi. She seemed happy. No advice issued from her, just an effervescent glow of deity energy. Fieros was standing, lingering, looking at the decorated statues in awe, soaking up as much of the view as he could before he was gently ushered away again. Futkim got the message and started to leave, feeling refreshed and somewhat dazed as always. He went out into the car park after putting his shoes back on and walked over to the solitary ivy-covered tree near the gates. He ruffled around in the ivy, and to his surprise, a little Lakshmi statue came crawling out of the dark green of the ivy. A present! He wondered for a moment whether he should take it or not, and then realised and reasoned of course he should. Someone had left that Lakshmi toy there for him to find. This was how the Hindus left gifts. He was sure of it. Fieros took the statue with excitement, left through the big open gates, and a jolly new jaunt began. Fieros tucked the Lakshmi statue into the neck of his t-shirt and nestled it at the top of his chest so that when he looked down, he could see and talk to the deity easily and readily. He carried on walking round Hounslow, but sadly all the weeds seemed to have run out for the day. It was time to follow the trail elsewhere. He wanted to live in London. He had always wanted to live in London. He'd promised the deities that by the end of the year he'd be living in London. So Futkim sneaked round the side of the barriers at Hounslow Central Station and got on the Piccadilly line to Piccadilly Circus. He was talking to himself out loud. He saw himself as an enlightened Buddha, and it was his role to teach others spirituality as he went along. He sat on the underground train and jabbered away his teaching lessons to the open air because no one was listening. Of course, his psychosis meant that not much of what he was saying made any sense to anyone but him, He wasn't to know that, though. He began teaching his nonsensical lessons any time other people were in long-term earshot, so the train was ideal. "Continue with your poping and monging," he said, and let the people carry on with their days. Crystal Iron Man was sensitive to the background energies, and he knew that even if no one appeared to be listening, the background energies were responding to him. He could feel it intuitively. The train pulled into Piccadilly Circus and Fieros hopped off and began navigating his way to the exit. He went through tunnels and up escalators and finally reached the exit barriers. He looked around at the guards and none of them were looking his way. Surreptitiously, Fieros unhooked the emergency exit gate and slipped through unnoticed. This was the way he always did it, and he never got caught jumping the trains in London. Being in London felt big, fresh and expansive. There were neon lights and big television screens in Piccadilly Circus. Fieros went over to the statue of the Earl of Shaftesbury and sat on one of the petal-shaped seats at the bottom of the statue, then stared up at the big television screens. Adverts for films and mobile phones were showing. It was Fieros's aim to watch every detail on every advert before moving on. He was mixing his consciousness with everything in the area, the statues at the top of the buildings, the traffic lights, the signs above shop fronts and the adverts. He sat, looked up at the big TV screens and stared. He noticed that no one else was watching them. He thought this was bad because they were all being hypnotized by the screens in their background awareness. This was bad because a violent film advert was showing. They would all be hypnotized into violence by the end of the night. There was nothing he could do except to remain highly conscious and neutralize the violence by becoming desensitized to it. So he sat and watched the screen for ages. When he felt he had absorbed everything the screens were showing, Fieros the Crystal Iron Man decided it was about time that he went to see Batman. Batman and Crystal Iron Man were teaching each other. Batman was a statue on top of the Odeon cinema nearby in Leicester Square, and Footkin would go to Batman whenever he came to London to learn about being a superhero, and Crystal Iron Man would teach Batman about meditation and consciousness. So Fieros got up off the Earl of Shaftesbury statue, checked around the floor, found a small nerp of weed, and went off across the way to sit with Batman and talk. As Fieros approached the Odeon, Batman emerged and loomed above him. Fieros locked on to Batman's statue and became transfixed. Batman was standing upright with his fists clenched by his side, cape frozen, rippling in the wind. What a powerful sight. So powerful, in fact, that as Fieros drew near to the entrance to the Odeon, Batman's energy rushed over him and knocked him off his feet, forcing him to sit down. He wobbled over to the concrete bench that formed a snake-like curve around the outskirts of a small park full of statues of popular culture icons and sat down in meditation pose. He smoked his joint nerp and gazed up at Batman. As the weed took effect, the silent communication between him and Batman began. Fieros was teaching Batman about meditation by sitting still and gazing at Batman, and Batman was teaching Fieros about being a superhero by standing tall and proud. But there was a real exchange of energies going on. Batman was making Fieros feel very grounded and connected to his body, and Fieros was helping Batman to still his mind and focus his chi. Of course, it was natural for Crystal Iron Man, being a superhero himself, to feel an affinity and connection to Batman. It couldn't last forever, however, as Crystal Iron Man needed to carry on his weed patrol, checking the floor, the corners and the flower beds. He got up, said goodbye to Batman and carried on searching for weed. Strangely, there wasn't very much lying around, which was disappointing, but there was a lot of leftover alcohol which made up for it. He drank rum and coke from plastic cups which had been left after drinkers had vanished into the night, and he ate pieces of pizza that had been left nearby as well. Since there was no weed, it was time to make a wider sweep of the area. The lights and abundance of statues and atmosphere was intoxicating enough. He loved being in London. Fjaros picked up a cigarette butt and smoked it while drinking leftover Heineken from a half-full bottle. And that's it. That is the official end of Crystal Iron Man. I haven't written any more than that. So I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it gave you a flavour of the journey of homelessness to psychosis, even though it wasn't in a particular, very particular date order. So that's it. Thanks for watching, and do give me your comments and feedback as to what you thought of the story, and maybe some suggestions if you want me to carry it forward. I might be able to write a bit more. I don't know. It just depends how the creativity genre strikes me at the time. So that's it. I'll see you on the next one, whenever that may be. Good night.